The Galactic Empire's war machine moved like a storm across the cosmos, consuming one system after another with cold efficiency. They had conquered civilizations that had existed for millennia, reduced fleets to drifting wreckage, and ground empires into dust beneath the march of their mechanized legions. When their warships arrived in the Sol system, they did not send diplomats. They sent ultimatums. Surrender, or be erased. Earth had no fleets to match the Empire's armadas. No planetary shields to repel the incoming assault. No energy weapons to contest their firepower. What it had, however, was something the Empire had dismissed outright. Humans who had spent centuries perfecting the art of war with weapons the galaxy deemed obsolete. The Empire's Supreme High Marshal had laughed when the first scans of Earth's arsenals arrived. Kinetic firearms, explosives based on chemical reactions, artillery firing solid projectiles instead of energy bursts. They had seen similar relics in the ruins of long-dead civilizations. The concept that any of this posed a real threat was absurd. Plasma weapons and energy shielding rendered such primitive arms irrelevant. The humans, as always, were predictable. They would fight because they were stubborn. They would lose because they were outmatched. Captain Jack Reynolds stood at the edge of the command center inside a hastily repurposed underground bunker, watching a grainy satellite feed of the Empire's landing ships descending through the atmosphere. Their sleek hulls gleamed in the daylight, formations of smaller attack craft escorting them in a slow, almost arrogant descent toward their designated drop zones. Behind Reynolds, his men were making final checks on their weapons, loading magazines, tightening straps, and adjusting scopes with the quiet efficiency of seasoned professionals. "We're really doing this," Sergeant Mike Bolcarter muttered, shaking his head as he fed a belt of ammunition into a mounted M2 Browning machine gun. "Fighting a bunch of alien bastards with gear my granddaddy used in Nam." "They think we're a joke," Corporal Ethan Hayes said, securing the sling of his battle rifle across his chest. "It'll be funny when they realize bullets still kill." Reynolds exhaled through his nose, his gaze locked onto the display as the first of the Empire's transports touched down. He could see the shimmering outlines of energy shields wrapping around their landing zones, a near-impenetrable barrier designed to deflect energy-based attacks. Against plasma rifles, it would have been flawless. Against what humanity had prepared, it was an oversight. "Command says the first wave is a show of force," Reynolds said. "They want us to know how badly we're outmatched before they give us one last chance to surrender." Carter spat onto the ground. Would have saved him the trouble if they just read our history books. The air above the battlefield shimmered as Imperial troopers marched forward in perfect formation. They were clad in gleaming white exo-armor, their movements eerily synchronized, their weapons pulsing with the glow of charged plasma cells. They carried themselves like conquerors. A towering figure emerged at the front of their formation, draped in ceremonial battle robes that swayed in the wind. Lord Zyler, the campaign's ground commander, raised a hand, signaling his forces to halt. His voice, artificially amplified, echoed across the battlefield in flawless English. "Humans of Earth," he declared, "your resistance is a farce. Your weapons are relics. Your armies are insignificant. We offer you one opportunity for survival. Lay down your arms, submit to Imperial rule, and you will be allowed to serve in capacities befitting your species. Resist, and your existence will be erased." Silence followed his words. The Imperial troops remained still, awaiting the inevitable surrender. Then, from the human line, a single rifle cracked. One shot, precise and deliberate, struck Lord Zyler's personal shield. The impact flared against the invisible barrier, failing to penetrate, but the message had been sent. Zyler turned his head slightly, regarding the distant human forces. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he gestured forward. The battle erupted in an instant. The first wave of plasma fire streaked through the air, leaving glowing trails in their wake as they slammed into concrete barriers and hastily erected defenses. The ground sizzled where the energy blast struck, sending shards of molten debris scattering. The Americans returned fire, unleashing controlled bursts of lead and steel, their rifles barking against the roar of distant artillery. The first Imperial casualties fell in seconds. Their shields, designed to deflect energy-based attacks, flickered wildly as high-caliber rounds slammed into them with raw kinetic force. The repeated impacts overwhelmed the barriers, shattering them outright. Bullets tore through exo-armor, punching ragged holes through once impenetrable plating. A squad of Imperials rushed forward, confident in their superior speed and reflexes. They were cut down before they made it halfway. A belt-fed M240 opened up from behind sandbags, tearing through their ranks in a brutal display of suppressive fire. Some tried to activate secondary shielding, but it wasn't designed to handle sustained kinetic bombardment. Their bodies crumpled as the rounds found their marks. Carter let out a short laugh as he watched another Imperial drop. His armor cracked open like a shattered ceramic plate. Looks like shields don't mean much when you put enough lead in them. The Empire's forces adjusted, deploying mechanized walkers to compensate for the unexpected resistance. The towering constructs strode forward with terrifying efficiency, their twin plasma cannons cycling up. The first blast tore through a human position, sending bodies flying. Another exploded against an abandoned vehicle, turning it into a fireball. Reynolds grabbed his radio. "We need heavy weapons now." Hayes sprinted through the trenches, grabbing an old but well-maintained recoilless rifle from a nearby cache. He dropped to one knee, bracing the launcher against his shoulder as he lined up a shot. The walker's cannons turned toward him, but before it could fire, he squeezed the trigger. The rocket spiraled through the air and struck just beneath the walker's cockpit. The explosion rocked the battlefield, sending a shockwave through the enemy ranks. When the smoke cleared, the Imperial machine lay on its side, half of its frame reduced to twisted metal. For the first time, hesitation rippled through the enemy lines. They had expected an easy victory. They had expected to crush humanity beneath their technological supremacy. Instead, they had learned that war was never about superiority alone. It was about adaptation. It was about resilience. It was about who could take a hit, stand back up, and fight even harder. Zyler stood at the rear, watching the chaos unfold. His expression was unreadable, but for the first time since the invasion began, he did not look amused. He looked calculating. Reynolds reloaded his rifle, glancing at his men. They were bloodied, battered, but still standing. The first engagement had been brutal, but the message had been delivered loud and clear. The Galactic Empire had underestimated humanity. That was their first mistake. It would not be their last. Smoke curled into the cold evening air, rising from the smoldering wreckage of downed Imperial walkers and shattered troop carriers. The battlefield, once a pristine landing zone, had become a graveyard of crushed exo-armor and scorched metal. Twilight bathed the ruins in a dim glow, casting long shadows over the entrenched human forces. The first wave had been repelled, but no one in the bunker celebrated. They all knew this was just the beginning. Captain Jack Reynolds knelt beside a fallen soldier, pressing 2 fingers to the man's neck. No pulse. The medic had already moved on, prioritizing those they could still save. Reynolds exhaled sharply, wiping his hand on his fatigues before standing. Around him, his men reloaded their weapons, checked their gear, and reinforced barricades. They had fought well, but they had paid the price in blood. Sergeant Mike Carter paced nearby, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. His usual sarcasm was gone, replaced with the cold focus of a man who knew the next fight would be even worse. "They're regrouping," Carter muttered, nodding toward the distant hills where the remnants of the Imperial force had fallen back. "Bet my last cigar they're calling in reinforcements." "They underestimated us once," Corporal Ethan Hayes said, slamming a fresh magazine into his rifle. "They won't make that mistake again." Reynolds turned toward the tactical map, flickering on a portable screen. The satellite feed showed incoming movement, multiple heat signatures massing beyond the ridgeline. More troops. Heavier armor. The Empire was adjusting, just as they were. "We hold this position," Reynolds said, his voice firm. "We dig in, reinforce, and adapt." A murmur of acknowledgement passed through the bunker. These men weren't green recruits. They were veterans, hardened by a dozen conflicts across Earth. They knew what it meant to fight a superior enemy. The key was to never let them dictate the battlefield. Minutes passed like hours. The silence before the next assault was suffocating. Then, from beyond the ridgeline, a low, mechanical rumble began to build. The ground trembled. In the distance, towering Imperial war machines crested the hill, larger than the walkers they had faced before. Their elongated forms bristled with weapons, energy shields rippling along their flanks. Reynolds felt the weight of the moment settle in his chest. This wasn't just another attack. This was a demonstration. The Empire was about to unleash its true firepower, and they wanted humanity to see it firsthand. A metallic voice crackled through the Empire's wideband communication channel, projected across the battlefield. "This resistance is futile," it declared. "Your weapons are obsolete. Surrender now, and you will be spared." No one responded. The answer had already been given. The first shot came from the enemy's side, a plasma blast the size of a car streaking toward their lines. It struck an abandoned building, obliterating it in a deafening explosion. Then the assault began. Imperial shock troops surged forward, their movements fluid, coordinated. The war machines advanced behind them, covering the charge with suppressive fire. The human defensive line erupted with return fire, rifles barking as snipers picked off enemy officers. Machine guns shredded through the front ranks, but the sheer numbers pressing forward were staggering. A trooper wielding a plasma rifle vaulted over cover, landing just feet from Carter's position. Carter reacted on instinct, driving his combat knife into the gap beneath the enemy's helmet. The trooper convulsed, then went limp. Hayes fired 3 rounds into another soldier's chest, the kinetic impact throwing him backward. He ducked as an energy blast seared the air above his head. "Captain," a voice called through the comms. "We need heavy firepower now." Reynolds didn't hesitate. He turned toward the far end of the trench, where a figure was already moving into position. Private First Class Danielle Bishop, the only woman in the unit, was hauling a rocket launcher onto her shoulder, her expression grim. The war machine in her sights loomed over the battlefield, its cannon charging another blast. Its energy shield shimmered as it absorbed small arms fire, but the humans had learned. Shields were designed for energy resistance, not raw kinetic impact. Bishop exhaled, steadying her aim. "Clear back blast," she shouted. The rocket streaked through the night, its contrail a burning line of defiance. It struck the walker dead center, the explosion tearing through its armor. The machine staggered, its shields flickering. A second shot followed, then a third. The behemoth groaned, metal twisting as it collapsed under its own weight. The battlefield shook as it hit the ground, flames licking at its remains. A stunned silence hung in the air. The Imperial troops hesitated. Their invincible war machine had fallen, just like the first. Reynolds seized the moment. "All units, push forward." The men surged from their positions, unleashing everything they had. Grenades sailed through the air, detonating in enemy clusters. Heavy machine guns tore through retreating forces. The disciplined, mechanical advance of the Empire crumbled under the sudden, ferocious counterattack. Panic rippled through the enemy ranks. The Imperials had expected slaughter. Instead, they were the ones being torn apart. Zyler, watching from a command ship above the battlefield, clenched his jaw. This was not how the battle was supposed to unfold. The humans were adapting. They were learning. He turned to his lieutenant. "Deploy the suppressors. If they refuse to bow, we will make them kneel." Back on the ground, Reynolds stood amid the carnage, his rifle smoking. His men had won this fight, but as he watched new blips appear on the satellite feed, dozens of incoming Imperial dropships, he knew the war was far from over. The horizon burned with the glow of descending Imperial dropships, their engines screaming as they tore through the atmosphere. Dust and debris whipped through the trenches as the humans braced for impact, their eyes locked on the sky. No one spoke. There was no need. The moment one battle ended, another began. Captain Jack Reynolds adjusted his grip on his rifle, his knuckles white against the worn metal. The last assault had cost them dearly, but they had held. Now the enemy was coming back with everything they had, and this time there would be no retreat. The silence before the storm was always the hardest part, but Reynolds had been through too many wars to let doubt take root. Sergeant Mike Carter stood nearby, scanning the rapidly approaching ships through a pair of binoculars. His face was unreadable, but his grip on his sidearm was tight. "Looks like they took that rocket launcher personally," Carter muttered, lowering the binoculars. "Those aren't regular troop carriers. That's suppression armor." Reynolds exhaled slowly. Suppressors. The Empire's version of executioners. Elite units built for one purpose: total eradication. They didn't just fight. They didn't just conquer. They erased resistance completely. Corporal Ethan Hayes slapped a fresh magazine into his rifle, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off exhaustion. They don't send in those things unless they're scared. "They should be," Carter said. "We're still standing." A sharp whistle cut through the air. The first dropship hit the ground, kicking up a wave of dust. Its ramp lowered, revealing the dark silhouettes of armored figures. They moved with mechanical precision, their weapons raised before their boots even touched the dirt. The second ship landed beside the first, then a third. The battlefield trembled beneath them. Reynolds took cover behind a half-crumbled wall, signaling his men into position. The first shots rang out, rapid and disciplined. The suppressors did not flinch. Plasma shields flickered as they advanced, absorbing incoming fire like a tide rolling against the shore. Their weapons returned fire in controlled bursts, each shot striking with lethal accuracy. A human soldier crumpled beside Reynolds, a burning hole in his chest. Another screamed as his cover disintegrated under an energy blast. The line was holding, but only barely. The suppressors were faster, stronger, and relentless. Hayes took down one of the armored figures with a well-placed shot to the neck joint, but before the body even hit the ground, another had taken its place. "We can't hold like this," Carter growled, ducking as a plasma bolt singed the air above his head. "We need something bigger." Reynolds tapped his comm bishop. Static crackled, then a response. "Still breathing, Captain." He didn't waste time. "You still have that launcher?" There was a pause. "Yeah, but I only have 2 rockets left. I make 'em count." "Then make them count now." Across the battlefield, Private First Class Danielle Bishop was already moving, keeping low as she navigated the debris-strewn terrain. The suppressors were advancing too fast. If she didn't take the shot now, they'd be inside the trenches before anyone could stop them. She found a vantage point behind a broken barricade, steadying the heavy weapon on her shoulder. The suppressors were clustered together, their formation tight. Perfect. She took a breath. Firing. The first rocket launched with a roar, streaking across the battlefield. The impact was immediate. The explosion tore through the advancing units, sending bodies and shrapnel flying. Suppressors were durable, but nothing walked away from a direct hit like that. The second rocket followed a heartbeat later. Another explosion. More chaos. The formation broke. "Push forward," Reynolds ordered. The humans surged from their cover, unloading everything they had. The suppressors, disoriented and unable to regroup, fell one by one. A soldier tackled a suppressor to the ground, driving a knife between the plates of its armor. Another fired point-blank into a downed enemy's visor. For the first time, the Empire's most feared warriors were on the defensive. But it wasn't over. Another dropship descended, larger than the others. Unlike the troop carriers, this one had no visible weapons. Instead, its hull gleamed with strange, shifting energy. The moment it touched the ground, an unnatural hum filled the air. Then the gravity shifted. Reynolds felt his stomach lurch as the air thickened. The suppressors, still standing, straightened as if rejuvenated. Human soldiers stumbled, their movements sluggish. Even bullets seemed to slow midair, their trajectories altered. A new voice echoed through the comms, smooth and deliberate. Your resistance is persistent, but predictable. A single figure emerged from the ship, clad in armor unlike any they had seen before. His presence alone seemed to distort the air around him. The battlefield itself seemed to bend in his favor. Carter gritted his teeth. Tell me that's not what I think it is. Reynolds' jaw tightened. It's a damn gravity caster. An Imperial officer with direct control over localized physics. The battlefield was no longer theirs. It belonged to him. The battlefield twisted under the oppressive force of the gravity caster's presence. The very air seemed to weigh down on the human soldiers, turning movement into a struggle. Reynolds could feel the unnatural pull in his limbs, a sickening sensation that made every action sluggish. Around him, his men fought against the invisible force, their boots sinking deeper into the dirt, their weapons feeling twice as heavy in their hands. The suppressors, however, moved freely. They advanced with renewed purpose, their formation tightening as they adjusted to the sudden shift in advantage. Plasma fire cut through the battlefield in precise, controlled bursts, striking down human soldiers before they could react. The gravity caster stood unmoving, his presence alone dictating the flow of combat. Carter dropped behind cover, panting. This isn't a fight anymore. It's execution. Reynolds gritted his teeth, forcing himself to adjust to the altered gravity. His mind raced. The suppressors were resilient, but they could be beaten. The gravity caster, however, was an entirely different problem. There was no fighting him under these conditions. As long as he controlled the field, every engagement was a slaughter. Bishop's voice crackled over the comms. I still got one rocket left. Reynolds' heart slammed against his ribs. The rocket launcher was the only weapon with enough force to change the tide, but under this gravity distortion, its trajectory could be thrown off. If she missed, there wouldn't be another shot. The suppressors pushed closer. Carter fired, dropping one, but another immediately filled the gap. Hayes grunted as a shot grazed his shoulder, leaving the fabric of his uniform smoking. They were running out of time. Reynolds pressed his comm. You need a clear shot. Not gonna get one. Bishop responded, breath heavy. I'll have to take it now or never. Reynolds exhaled sharply. He had no better options. Take it. Across the battlefield, Bishop steadied the launcher against her shoulder. The weight felt heavier than before, the gravity pressing down on her like an unseen hand trying to force her into the ground. The suppressors were closing in fast, and the gravity caster stood at the center of it all, untouched, his armor gleaming under the strange energy that rippled around him. She adjusted for the distortion, forced her breathing to steady, and fired. The rocket spiraled off its path almost instantly, the altered gravity pulling at it, trying to drag it off course. But Bishop had anticipated it. She had aimed too high, too wide, trusting physics to betray itself. The suppressors moved to intercept, but it was too fast, too sudden. The gravity caster turned, sensing the threat too late. The explosion erupted at the caster's feet, a shockwave tearing through the battlefield. The rippling energy around him shattered, and the gravity distortion vanished in an instant. The sudden release sent bodies tumbling, human and suppressor alike. Reynolds felt the air lighten, the weight in his limbs disappearing. He moved before his mind had time to register the shift, rifle up, finger tightening on the trigger. The suppressors hesitated, their advantage gone. That was all the humans needed. Carter shot the first one through the visor, sending him crashing backward. Hayes moved with practiced efficiency, dropping two in quick succession. The remaining suppressors tried to regroup, but they were no longer facing men who were barely standing. They were facing Americans, with nothing left to lose. Reynolds fired, his shots precise, cutting through the enemy ranks. The suppressors faltered, their cohesion breaking. The Empire had relied too heavily on its technology, believing their superior tactics would render human resistance irrelevant. But they had made a fatal mistake. They had underestimated the will to fight. Bishop dropped the empty launcher and switched to her rifle. Push him back. The humans surged forward, pressing the advantage. The suppressors, once the embodiment of Imperial dominance, now scrambled for cover, their formations crumbling. Some tried to retreat, others fought until the last moment, but the outcome was inevitable. The last suppressor fell with a final, desperate shot that missed its mark. The battlefield fell silent except for the crackling of burning wreckage and the ragged breathing of the remaining soldiers. The sky, once darkened by descending Imperial ships, was now empty. Reynolds surveyed the field, his grip tightening around his rifle. Bodies lay strewn across the dirt, human and alien alike. The cost had been high, too high, but they had won. Carter leaned against a broken barricade, wiping blood from his face. Think they'll be back? Reynolds exhaled. Probably. Hayes kicked at a fallen suppressor. Then we'll be ready. Bishop sat on a piece of rubble, hands resting on her knees. They thought we were weak because we used old weapons. They thought they'd break us. Guess they forgot who they were dealing with. Reynolds nodded. The Empire would come again. They would adapt, improve, build newer, stronger weapons. But so would they. Humanity had been underestimated before. It would happen again. And each time, the galaxy would learn the same lesson. You don't back humans into a corner. Because when you do, they don't just survive. They win.